I was thirsty, and you gave me water.
Okay, welcome everybody. we're going to get started. I think there'll be a few other people that find their way in, and that's great. We've got lots of space. I appreciate that everyone took the back spots to make it easy for them. Sort of classic. Yeah. Welcome here. My name is Alan Reeser McDowell, and I am a colleague for many of you and know most of you here. But I'm working from Ottawa. What is that? Is that me? Live streaming at its best. But yeah, so it is wonderful to be back here. I moved to Ottawa in September, and obviously I come every once in a while, but it does feel like a bit of a second home being back here and working with you folks. So it is great to be here. Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to join Rick and I. Rick, you folks know well, and he and I will share the time today to basically provide a bit of an overview and share some stories from our recent trip to Zambia, Lesotho, and South Africa in January and early February. So one of the things that I often like to start with in any presentation that I do on behalf of MCC is to read out the mission and vision of MCC, and it's something that I don't actually get tired of, and I think is a good starting place, even for those of us who know the organization well. MCC, a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches, shares God's love and compassion for all in the name of Christ by responding to basic human needs and working for peace and justice. MCC envisions communities worldwide in right relationship with God, one another, and creation. And we carry out that mission in partnership. And I would like to just hear really, really quickly, who do you think of when we talk about partnerships? And specifically in terms of MCC, who comes to mind? Or what?
I think local. Like the first thing that comes to mind is local, on the ground.
Okay. So sort of like the implementing, people implementing the projects.
Yeah, that are in the culture, local,
Okay.
live there, know the customs, know the work.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Churches.
Churches?
Donors.
Yeah. The donors? Volunteers? There's a lot of different people that help make MCC's mission possible. And
people who read the Rejoice magazine and see our little prayer requests in the back and remember that
yeah.
we're going to pray for South Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, so the church's side can also be people praying in churches for their work, churches supporting financially. There's a lot, and individuals within those churches. So there's a lot of different partners, and I think that's helpful. One of the helpful contexts that I'm hoping that we can think about as we go through the lunch today. So one of the particular partners that MCC in Ontario has worked very closely with over the last 10 years, in fact, and Dan Dreger is here. You worked very closely with this partner as well in the past. But the Meeting House, and that was, they're a church that specifically has partnered with MCC for 10 years, but they've been present in Ontario since the 80s. Brethren in Christ Church. And the main reason that Rick and I were traveling, which we'll talk a little bit more about in terms of where, was to connect with Meeting House funded projects in Southern Africa, and then also to participate in a peace exchange that brought together some of MCC's staff and partners, and a lot of what Kim was talking about, the people actually doing the implementation of our peace building projects on the ground in various countries, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, although it did include staff from Egypt as well. And just a brief overview, or just a couple pieces around the Meeting House partnership. As I mentioned, 10 years. Well, the first 9 years of that partnership was focused on Southern Africa, and I'll highlight a map here in a second that will show some of those countries. But particularly in terms of thematic focus was around HIV and AIDS. And so, as you can remember, 90s and early 2000s especially, the sort of scourge of HIV, especially in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, was a really significant thing that was happening in terms of health and development around the world. And the Meeting House felt in particular that they were moved to respond with compassion to people who were affected personally or even family members in a variety of levels to HIV/AIDS crisis. In the last year, and this is in conversations over a couple of years, Meeting House has shifted their focus to partnering with MCC, really finding an alignment with the BIC and Meeting House's mission in particular. One of their main priorities is being followers of Jesus, but living out that call to be peace builders in the world. And this is very similar in terms of MCC's distinctive or a unique aspect of MCC, where we focus on relief development, but also peace building work, which really separates us from many other development organizations that would maybe do the former two, but not as much focused on the conflict transformation, the trauma healing, the peace building work. So that was an alignment between between Meeting House and MCC, which was we felt was something really significant that we can continue the partnership with them in the future. So this is one little visual. I wanted to highlight this because it's the first what they call Peacemakers campaign that the Meeting House was involved with just recently. And I just wanted to mention one thing which I'm really happy about, that in fact they had a goal of 2,550 peace cards, which were $100 each, and then 1,000 relief kits as part of this campaign that just was completed. This was right around the time that, in fact, Rick and I were traveling, that this campaign was being launched. But we do know the results, and Shar had just provided this last week. But they actually were able to fundraise $266,000 and then 1,600 relief kits, which Carolyn is like sort of shaking her head a bit because we have a warehouse full of kits that she hasn't been able to actually ship out to Syria yet. But all that to say, it was a real successful campaign, and for us, with transitioning from the HIV/AIDS focus to now a peace building one, we're really, really thankful to God and to the many people who have contributed to making that a success. So that's sort of a bit of the backdrop in terms of Rick and I's travel, because a lot of what we focused on was really around Meeting House supported projects. Now, one other question I wanted to ask about is when you think about MCC's peace building work, and it kind of relates to the partnership question, but who do you think of in terms of our peace and justice work around the world? Who are the different people that are part of that partnership? For me, there's sort of a couple angles to it. We have the donor side, so an example is like a Meeting House church, there's individuals, there's people that are specifically contributing to support our peace work. We have the implementers, there's MCC that's kind of in the middle, making all those connections, helping to direct the projects. I think that's one part of the partnership, and then I think the other piece that I think is important for us to consider is that each of us who are involved in peace work, whether it's on the donor side, whether it's on the implementer side, anyone else volunteering, we all doing our part partner with God as part of a much broader picture of reconciliation in the world that God has a vision for. And I think that's also something that we wanted to have as a bit of a backstop or a kind of a context for the stories that we're going to be telling. So just really briefly before I pass over to Rick, I did want to highlight where we were. Can everyone see that okay from there? I'm getting a bit of a glare. I guess it's on from this side. So we landed in Lusaka, which is the capital in Zambia. And we were, in fact, hosted by the MCC reps there, and then also Isa Ibambolo, who's a friend of ours here, finishing, in fact, he just graduated from his master's in peace and conflict transformation, or peace and conflict studies. And then we traveled, so we visited partners there, and then we traveled down towards Livingston, we were around Vic Falls, and then flew from here. And I should say just really briefly that the Brethren in Christ Church is very strong in Zambia, and a lot of that presence is in southern province down here. And we then flew to Joburg, which is in South Africa. And then that's where the Peace Exchange was, just outside of Joburg. And then we traveled into Lesotho, which is a landlocked country in the middle of South Africa. Visited projects in around in Lesotho, and then also Pietermaritzburg and Durban. And this is actually where MCC's office is for Swalesa, which stands for Swaziland, Lesotho, and South Africa. So that's sort of our home base for MCC's work there. And Lusaka, I should have mentioned, that's where MCC is main office is there. So Lesotho is part of the broader program in Swalesa. Rick, is there anything that I missed in terms of intro? Maybe, if not, maybe I'll get you to come up and we can share a
Did you
few
say
stories.
that you are giving leadership to the relationship building with our friends at the meeting house?
No, I didn't.
But you
I
are.
am doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's important that people know that. That's a big part
Yes.
of why we were giving
That's right. Thank
leadership
you.
here. And doing a fine job, I might add, making Carolyn's life more difficult because now she has 600 extra kids. Although, just little side, we had great fun the other night with a whole bunch of folks from the Markham Waterloo Church who came in and packed about half of the excess. And if I'm not mistaken, their youth group is coming in.
Yeah, they ended
Or
up
is-
bragging about a youth group of 500 students, and so I said, oh, show me some of them. So they're coming this Wednesday, not all 500.
This is the group that you have to put upper limits on, or they'll bring you too many people. Well, thanks, Alan, for setting this up so far. I'm going to reintroduce you to this guy. Some of you will recognize him by his classic shirt that he often shows up in around here. This is Isa Ebombolo, who Alan mentioned briefly. He just graduated this weekend from Grable and is headed back to Zambia to give leadership to MCC peace programs there, at least in Zambia, and my guess is he's going to show himself to be the kind of leader that MCC will give him responsibility for a broader region, probably, my guess is all of Southern Africa. Isa grew up in the Congo. Some of you know his story, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Grew up in a Muslim family, fair bit of turmoil. He told us this story over crocodile at a restaurant in Victoria Falls. Over crocodile, I mean we were eating crocodile, not the other way around, thankfully. How he was converted by a street preacher in, I forget which city in Congo. There's this very, quite dramatic story. But even more dramatic is he left Congo as a young man, and he describes it as stepping over dead bodies as he was leaving. So like a number of the partners, both now current staff or partners of MCC, Isa is another African man who should have.
That's not.
That is me. Sorry, Louise. I think she's on her way up here. Oh, yes, great. Greetings. Sorry about you friends that I walked away from them. Isa, like many others from places like Nigeria, Congo, should be caught up in a cycle of violence. They had all the preconditions, witnessed violence, had violence done against them, had violence done against their families, tragic, tragic losses, and somehow stepped out of that. And I would say in all cases that was in part a transformative or conversion style experience for them. And in many, many cases, and we met a number of them at the network gathering that Alan has spoken to you about, who are now leaders and have really gone through a transformation that is both remarkable and rare. And that they are now MCC's partners, and they're really, those of you who work for MCC, they're our colleagues. And Isa would certainly be one of these. I would say rather than becoming violent and vengeful, I don't know if these are properly used words, but I would describe him as being either vulnerably revolutionary or revolutionarily vulnerable. Like choosing to put love first and take risks and give leadership to the kind of work that MCC wants to do in peace building. one of the times during this network gathering, Isa put up his hand. He's remarkable in a variety of ways. He's probably the most feminist man that I met. And he always would speak to, well, how is this going to impact women? Or how are women going to be engaged in this and have a serious voice in this? And he also spoke one time when people were talking about, well, what is it that MCC brings to this? What is it that MCC actually contributes to peace building in Africa? And he said, first of all, you need to be sensitive to what are the traditional approaches to peace building, because not everything that's done at Grable and Eastern Mennonite and all of the places where we've kind of dove in deeply and developed academic rigor around peace building, there are a lot of traditional practices. And maybe our friend from Nigeria here could tell us what are some of the things that are born and raised in Congo and Nigeria that MCC has to figure out as well. But he also made this comment. He said, when you come, don't ask, what do you need and how can we help? Ask, what do you have and what are you doing? So Alan and I were talking about this a bit before we started, and Alan reminded me that it's a little bit like the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus won't let the disciples start from a place of impoverishment, where they think we only have this tiny little basket of fishes and loaves, and instead insists that you start with an understanding of abundance, and then you figure out how to share it. And so the miraculous, well, I might get into theological thin ice here if I start talking about exactly what the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is. But for me, it's about failure to start from a place of poverty, and then a choice to share, which is quite counter to what the expectation might have been. So that's Isa. Many of you know the Chibolya story. I'll just give you a little hint at it if you want to hear it in greater length. It's a powerful story. He told it at the relief sale banquet now 2 years ago, Kim, right?
Yeah.
2 years ago. It's the story of where the principal is absconding with the fees that the students are paying in order for them to write their next graduation exam, and the parents get wind of this, and they are armed and dangerous and coming to do serious harm to this principal when the children who have been studying the Peace Club's curriculum, written and invented by this guy, they intervene and essentially save this man's life, dignity at least, and maybe his life. And they end up holding him responsible. He makes reparations, and eventually they get to write their exams. But I'm not going to tell you that story. The other Peace Club story that Isa shares is of a BIC school, Brethren in Christ School. Alan mentioned too that in southern Zambia, the Brethren in Christ Church is very, very strong. We met the bishop there and had a brief encounter with one of the congregations. They have a number of schools, and one of those schools was known for bullying. There was just a lot of schoolyard violence. And so the local board reached out for a principal that they thought could really make a difference there, and they purposely reached out for somebody who was tough. He was known to be willing to use corporal punishment, to be willing to use a very tough, not only emotional presence, but also physical presence to whip students into line and create order in a school. Oddly enough, at the same time as that board chose to start using peace clubs in the same school. So gradually they began to start noticing a difference, and of course his principal was proudly taking responsibility for this, that his tough guy image in the classroom and on the schoolyard was making a difference. But gradually, again, the students who were learning the peace clubs ways, which are essentially dialogue and discussion as ways of resolving conflict, came to him and challenged him and said that in fact we think it's what we're doing, what's happening in the classroom, and what we're then able to practice informally on the soccer pitch and elsewhere that's making a difference in our school. Eventually he caught on to that, the local board caught on, and he then became more of an itinerant principal, taking peace clubs to other schools and trying to integrate them into curriculum in ways that they could get similar results to his initial school. So that's our friend Isa. And these are the students from Chibolya now. We could hardly get there. I have to keep standing back in the right place here. Even with four-wheel drive pickups, this really is, as the name means in English, it's not the deserted place. Remember, Alan, what the name of the town means? Not deserted, but forgot, something like that. There's another English word that would be even a better translation. And it really is a swampy verb of Lusaka that after the rains, and we were in the rainy season, you can barely get to. So these would now be the younger brothers and sisters of the group that saved their principal from being stormed by angry parents. Same school. Actually, one more thought about Isa. Some of you know that now that he's graduated, he's going to spend some time here in Ontario for the next month and a half or so, and his dance card is full. All kinds of people have heard about peace clubs, and he's basically had his head down doing his studies at Grable, but spoken here and there, and been at the meeting house, and the meeting house has really embraced this, and they are having him come and do some trainings with their compassion leadership, and they really are looking, hopefully, at building this into their children's curriculum as a standard issue part of what you get when you come to the meeting house as a family. Your kids get introduced to peace clubs. So he is wanting to know more about us here at MCC, but there's a wonderful, ironic way in which the gospel of peace is coming back to us from Zambia through our dear friend Isa, and there's huge, huge interest. So we're very excited about spending lots of time with him here in Ontario for the next few weeks. Who's been to Victoria Falls? I know. Yeah, if you ever get the chance. It's remarkable in a number of ways. We were there in rainy season, and sorry, this is a cell phone photo, but it is also just a thick, thick mist, which is, of course, all being produced by the splash and the thunder here. So I know there are times, in fact, when we were with the Zambian reps, they have photos of being there in dry season, and you can walk all the way out here, and somewhere there's a little island that you can sit on and have your picnic and be in no danger whatsoever. But this was not the dry season. So, a few lines from my journal that day. Victoria Falls, a natural wonder, is also a spiritual wonder. Ignoring the offer to rent rainwear, which we could have for like $2, but we didn't rent the raincoats. We hiked out on that jutting knife of land, right here. So there's the face of the falls, and this knife of land is right in front of the falls, and you're looking onto the face of them. Okay, how far away were we, Alan? Louise would say 50 feet, but I always say she exaggerates, so we weren't that close. We were close. So unlike Niagara or any other major waterfall I have visited, this jutting knife of land takes you right into the face of the falls. You are gradually, but fully, soaked to the skin by the billowing mist as all the power of the rainy season in the heart of Africa pours over the cliffs. You feel cleansed. You feel pulled into a full-body experience of creation as you hear and see and smell and feel the soaking of creation by the Creator. We left feeling ready and prepared for the rest of Southern Africa in a way that we could not have without passing through Miso Otunya, the thunder that smokes. Later, when we listened to the many stories of peace builders in the MCC Africa community who had been transformed by coming through the thunder of violence, I reflected on how doing our work, especially our peace work, is best done by those who are transformed and refreshed by the soaking of the Jesus Spirit. Of course, we can do our work well as professionals, as people who are trained and experienced and committed. But that can be a little bit like going to the falls with a raincoat. You don't get immersed. You don't get taken into the depth of the both sacrificial but also redemptive love. As MCC, serving in the name of Christ, we go to the falls, a famous and important place, and when we go without a raincoat. And we have a full-bodied, Jesus loves you and me, peace experience. So that's how I remember Victoria Falls. Okay, this is a terrible photo, but a funny story. So this is the airport at Livingston, Victoria Falls. We flew from here to Johannesburg. And this woman is working security, pulled me aside and said, there's a mass of metal in your in your suitcase. I knew what it was. We opened it up, and it was 50 of these peace buttons, MCC peace buttons. So she wanted to know what they were and why I had them and where I was going. And I could see that she was getting less grim and more, not exactly jolly, but at least having a conversation with me. And eventually I saw that she was going to let me keep them, and I asked her if she wanted one. And she said, I guess she'd take one. I said, would you put it on? So eventually she put it on. I said, could I take a photograph of you? And she said, sure. And I said, could I put it on Facebook? And she looked at her supervisor, and eventually she said yes. And now she's my friend on Facebook, and if I post things, she's one of the first people on there. And in some ways, this is another meaningless Facebook friend, but I somehow have continued to draw a little bit of hope and encouragement from this, that maybe it's not meaningless, and maybe there's just a little sliver of something worthwhile that both of us exchanged that day. And so that's why I tell her that story. Then the peace exchange. This is another of our colleagues. This man's name is James. He is working in a tough, tough place in South Sudan, based in Juba. He had just been to Rumbek, which is where MCC's main project is, a global family, well, not called global family anymore, but an education project, where we're partnering with Loretto nuns from Ireland, growing food, doing peace clubs in the heart of what is an increasingly failing state. And James was just not daunted. He was so excited to be there. So just to fill out a little more than of what Alan had said before, people like Isa, James, this was a first ever attempt to get all the peace building, and of course they couldn't all get there. There were visa issues and so on. But the idea was all our staff and representatives of all our partners that are doing peace work, from sort of Chad to Ethiopia and Egypt to South Africa, and all points in between where we're active in peace, have them all come together, share best practices, just be together, know who they are, inspire each other, be supportive of each other. And the one day, I think it was the Thursday, we watched the formation of the most recent official MCC network. So there's now an African Peace Network that has a coordinator, and they've got a bit of a plan of how often we're going to meet. So it's very exciting to watch what is really, as I'm out speaking, I often say, I do the relief, share examples, development, share examples, and then peace, which really often undergirds to say that when there is violence or the threat of violence, you don't have solid development and relief doesn't last. You're always coming back to peace building if you're going to create the preconditions for not needing relief work and often for having solid development work. So James is another of my heroes now from in this case, South Sudan, who is one of the partners that Alan talked about, and actually now is a colleague. So back to Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the challenges is who do you tell stories about? Because we must have met 50 people that any single one of them you could talk about for an hour in terms of their life story. I think, Rick mentioned people who are immersed in this stuff, and I think these are two people that have amazing stories, very different from one another, but something that it's good for us to know who are these people that are actually that we are on our staff, who we are partnering with to do this work. So I'll mention Serge. Serge is one of MC's staff in Eastern Congo, and in fact, a lot of people, that part of the world hasn't been on the radar until recently when Brother Sharp was killed a few weeks ago. And he's actually a student that went to EMU at the same time as myself, an MCC colleague, and then was killed when he was working with the UN in that part of the world. That part of the world is where Serge is working on behalf of MCC. And he's also someone, just like Rick mentioned, Issa tells a story of stepping over bodies as he's getting away. Serge didn't leave Congo, but has an experience, as a child even. I think he mentioned maybe he was 11 or 12 years old. Some passing militants that came through his village forced him and his friend to carry their bags all day long. And this is something that's quite common, he said. People come through, they grab some kids and just say, hey, you're coming with us. Make them carry all their stuff for the whole day. It gets to the end of the day, And one of the leaders basically says to the kids, "Are you tired? Do you want some rest?" And Serge somehow, I'm not exactly quite sure what the story was, but one of the people as part of this militant group had actually tipped him off. He said, "If you get asked at the end of the day, 'Are you tired? Do you want rest?' say, 'No, I'm strong.'" Sorry, can you finish?
Very good. Yeah. I think it was one of the wives of one of these militants that had warned him, but somehow she hadn't managed to warn his best friend, who was also traveling with them carrying these bags. And so when they asked him, he just spoke honestly and said, "Yes, of course I'm tired. I've been carrying your bags all day." And they shot and killed him. And instead of, even though they'd been walking a long time, it turns out they had been meandering, and he found an old gentleman and took him back to the village quite quickly, and he sat down with his father. And his father had this very strong counsel for him about encouraging him not to take revenge, looking for a third way. And thankfully, he took his father's counsel and now has found a way of being another of our colleagues. You okay, Alan?
I think so. Excuse me. Kuda was here a few years ago, I think 2013. He's another fellow. He's actually a partner of MCC and works with the Zimbabwe police force, basically doing training in nonviolence with the police. And this is a state where violence is regularly used by the state and by the president Mugabe in particular to enforce and grow the power that's already in his hands. And his job is, and it's interesting because it's blessed by the state, oddly enough, and I can't quite figure out why this is the case, but he is an MCC partner, training police officers all the way from constables on the streets and all the way to the top leadership on alternatives to violence when they're dealing with situations on the ground. And so he even has, it's interesting, he's on speed dial for police officers that when they run into a situation they don't know how to handle, they'll call Kuda. Say, "Hey, here's what I'm doing, here's the situation, can you help me," kind of thing. So we have people like this, and these are the people that are carrying out MCC's work. It's amazing.
Yeah, you should say a bit more about Kuda, about his life, like the risks that he's taking in this.
Yeah, well, and it's, well, do you have an answer for that? Is that what, I mean, do you have something in particular?
Well, I just remember hearing
Yeah.
about the government actually has controlled the police, and now he's working with the police and the citizens, and the government isn't so keen on him.
Yeah,
And his life is-
it's interesting because, and this is what I was trying to say, it's sort of a tenuous situation where the state often uses the police and other groups for violence, but he's kind of in a spot where he has to be very, very careful what he says, he has to be very careful to not sort of rub people the wrong way, but he is in a situation where he's constantly, he has to be aware that his life is at risk at all times, basically. So he's accepted this, and I think he is probably like a lot of other people who are doing tough work, that they just sort of say, "This is my life, and I'm committed to this," and they have to hold it to a certain extent fairly lightly. But yeah, it's a tough place to be doing peace building work, and we're thankful for people like him who are doing so. One other thing I did want to mention, just sort of circling back to the meeting house, and this is actually not a peace project, but the meeting house, as I mentioned, was supporting HIV/AIDS work for many, many years, 9 years. And one of the things I wanted to say about, and I really appreciate about this, is the approach that they've taken. So we've decided that we want to shift the theme to a peace building focus, but one of the things that the meeting house is committed to is basically not dropping any projects that they were helping to fund before. And this is one of the examples of a project in Lesotho that meeting house is supporting, helping make possible that we were able to visit. So this is actually a daycare just in this building behind, and we were able to visit. And it's focused on kids who are orphans, basically from HIV. Parents have died, often both parents, and so you'll have grandparent-led families, and you have children, and sometimes it's even not with, the grandparents might not be around, so it might actually be an older sibling taking care of younger siblings, and you can imagine the challenges faced by the families like that. So all of these kids are orphans. They're fed, they're provided just a pretty standard, like you looked at the schedule and it's not much different than Emerson, my son's daycare schedule, right? But I think it's a bit of normalcy and also a meal to provide. And one of the sad things that you can still imagine, there's a lot of challenges for these families, but for a number of these kids, the meal that they get on Friday at school is the last one until they come back to daycare on Monday. So that's the sort of severity of the situation, just the basic needs that are being met through some of these projects. So mostly we focused on peace-building projects, but we did have a chance to connect with some of these as well. And I think it also provides a helpful reminder that, while there's, in a lot of parts of the world, there's even been significant progress in terms of addressing poverty and over the last 3 decades, there's a huge number, like millions and millions of people have been brought out of poverty, which is a huge thing to celebrate. But there are still situations where MCC and through our partnerships with churches and others are responding to really, really basic needs, and that's helpful to be reminded of too. I think we can open it up to Q&A, and then, so Rick, why don't you come back up as well, and we can...
Or I can run this around if people have questions, because Greg would really like if who are listening even more than Greg would like if we would use this. So if you have thoughts or questions or comments, or you want to debate things that we've said, Kim.
Debate?
That's what Kim's saying.
No, did anything surprise you?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things. I think for me, I mentioned that being reminded of the basic needs. I think, we've heard, and it's true, that in general, the AIDS crisis in Southern Africa, it's not as bad as it was. There's, with ARVs, with antiretrovirals, and the amount of support that's been provided, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there is not the same level of crisis that was present 10, 20 years ago. But as you can see with a picture like that, all these kids are orphans, and it's still the percentage of people living with HIV/AIDS is still really high in places like Lesotho. I think it's something like the adult population is like 30%. So you think about in a room like this, 10 people are infected with HIV/AIDS. The difference is that they're living now. So while so many of them would have died, now with the medication that's available, people are able to survive. And so it's a much different scene than it was. But for me, I was still quite shocked at the number of children without parents and just the struggles that would. They're going to face for the rest of their lives, right? Because how do you get a start in that situation? It's a real challenge. I think daycare like that, where they get a half-decent education, they get fed, that's a huge start. But there's still, I was quite surprised, and I don't know if overwhelmed, but it was, I had a few tough days in Lesotho, I would say. You want to add anything, Rick?
Certainly the living with rather than dying from AIDS was remarkable. Obviously I hadn't been in that part of the world before, so it was all from a distance, but it really was driven home. I don't know, Kim, if this was necessarily as much a surprise as a saddening, and this, I am careful how I say this, but the transition this is South Africa now, since apartheid ended officially in '94, to the African National Congress Party having power, and the difficulty in moving into a peaceful democracy after the several generations of apartheid is a long and tortuous process. And now I'm paying more attention again to South Africa than I probably had for the previous 10 years. Those of us who are, in their 50s, who remember apartheid and thought it would never end, and were part of, recognizing the boycott and all of those ways in which, frankly, everyone loved to hate South Africa for a couple of decades. But to see that painfully slow process for them to move now towards a mixed race democracy, I said this to James Alty one time, who is, along with his wife Joan, they're the area directors for Southern Africa. And they said, well, you can't expect, people to move immediately to a healthy functioning democracy. And it was a few days after the inauguration of our president to the south here. And I thought, well, healthy democracies, they go through ups and downs, and it's not all one straight line, and then you're healthy and you stay there necessarily. So that's hard to see, and how does race play into all of that, and how does MCC find a position of being truly in favor of a non-race based government when a lot of the power, wealth of course, is still heavily concentrated in a small white population. Discouraging, but not impossible. Okay, I'm coming to you, Kay. Yes.
So, just speaking about HIV and conflict, about 6 days ago, I was reading that in Nigeria, in the IDP camps, so there's a terrorist group right now in the northern part of Nigeria where you have people who practice Islam. So, a lot of people have been displaced, and between January and March this year, they've had almost 4,000 new cases of HIV in the IDP camps. So when we talk about peace and conflict, there are actually ripple effects that go from just the war itself, because now they live in camps and suddenly you have 4,000 new cases of HIV just within a state, Nigeria, and there are 36 states of like lots and lots of people. So there's just that connection just really came to me when you mentioned, So for the most part, it's not everywhere in Nigeria, it's not in the south, but just where there's conflict, then you get all these other issues just...
Which goes back to what Rick was saying in terms of peace being an important sort of foundation. Because when you don't have that, then you have more issues in terms of health and broader development issues and relief.
So this is one of the risks. Exactly, because this is not relief isn't going to solve this, because we're talking HIV here, and even development is not going to be able to solve everything, because not everyone's going to get tested, not everyone is going to actually get treated, and then people start dying, and then kids are, it's just a cycle of stuff.
Yeah, that's a fair point, that what we were both observing of a general decline assumes the absence of vicious violence like Nigeria or Congo. If rape is a weapon of war, then HIV/AIDS rates are going to rise again. Anyone else? Alan, anything come to you that we didn't have part of our plans? What is?
Does that ever happen?
Well, I would like to close in a prayer, and I would like to use some of the words from our friend Isa that I had shared earlier. So, let's pray together. Loving God, who brings us together here as colleagues and friends and people who follow you, we often are struck by our own abundance and how we are called to share and to be generous. Sometimes we can also be struck by the irony of people who we think or assume have much less and are operating from scarcity actually can come back to us with messages of hope and reconciliation. So we think particularly of our brother Isa today, who could have chosen a very different path of vengeance and violence, and instead has accepted an invitation from you and from his faith community to step above that, and now has shared that here amongst us, and has also reminded us that when we come to him and to his community and his country, his continent, that instead of coming with a question of what do you need and how can we help, at times the appropriate question may be, what do you have and what are you doing? Help us to remember that and make that part of our work and the many organizations with whom we labor here. And thank you that we can do all this in the knowledge and the assurance that you go before us and you go with us. Amen. Thank you, everybody, here and remotely. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Rick.